Welcome to Venice Island from a Distance. Venice Island is a community-based performing arts center that believes in the power of arts and entertainment as a way of bringing people together and fostering community. As such, we have a responsibility to amplify the important work of marginalized voices in our community and to advance the conversation surrounding race and the arts, a conversation which has reached a fever pitch in light of recent civil unrest and continuing examples of systematic racism and violence in our communities. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are unable to have these voices live on our stage. So instead, every Monday night for the past 2 months, we have been posting these informal interviews with artists and collaborators in our city who have had much to say about the role of arts and culture in the midst of racial, political, health, and financial crises. My name is Herman, and I have been one of the hosts of this series. Tonight is our final installment of Venice Island from a Distance. And so I am joined by our two esteemed co-hosts, Daralyse Lyons and Ryan Rebel, and we'll be discussing our thoughts on the series as a whole and how the themes raised in this series impact our work as artists. So Daralyse and Ryan, welcome. It's great to have us all, not necessarily in the same place, but at least on the same screen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting, right, to be on the other side of the camera. So it's great to be here.
Totally. Go ahead.
Not in the same place, but in the same space.
And that's just defined the last 5 months, hasn't it? It's like none of us are really in the same space, but virtual space has taken on, a meaning of its own. Just being in the same virtual space is our way of connecting these days, and that's kind of what we've been trying to do with this interview series as a whole. Still be able to connect with people and connect with artists and talk about these important issues, but in a virtual space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of the rest of the interview series, we've spent so much time focusing on our wonderful guests and their work and their accomplishments that tonight I would love our audience to hear a little bit about you. So Daralyse, why don't you start and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Daralyse Lyons, as I'm sure you all know and can see on the screen, but yeah, I am a transformational storyteller, and so I use the power of stories to transform lives. And one of my really driving forces has been to amplify marginalized voices. And so I've been doing a lot of work in the diversity space, and I can speak a little more to what I'm doing a little later on in the conversation. But yeah, I mean, I do a wide array of things, from writing books to journalism, to performing on stage when that's viable, and all of it really centers around just how important stories are, and how we can use stories as a way of understanding one another and ourselves more deeply.
So important as an artist to also be a storyteller. And Dara and I know each other from the improv world, so there's a lot of worlds that are kind of colliding here. Dara and I are both members of Comedy Sports Philadelphia, along with Darryl Charles, who Dara interviewed earlier in this series. And Ryan, you're an improviser as well.
Sure, it's been a little bit since I've improvised. I had one little quarantine improv session just with people I was stuck in the house with. But yeah, I'm Ryan. I use he, him pronouns. I grew up in the burbs of Pittsburgh, moved out here for college, decided I wanted to stick around, progressively got more and more invested in theater and the theater scene. And I have explored a lot of different facets of that. What started with acting has become directing, improvising, writing criticism, writing plays, tech work, backstage tech work, dramaturgy, all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
And how, Ryan, since a lot of your work is sort of forward-facing, how are you navigating that during the time of the pandemic?
Could you define forward-facing for me?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I think what I mean by that is, if you're doing a lot of kind of directing and you're doing a lot of work in theater, I feel like a lot of that, people are taking to the stage, right? They're performing. There's a lot of kind of like engaging with the community. It's a little bit different than maybe what I might be doing when I'm working on my latest novel, like, writing in my apartment, which I can do equally well, right? Like whether or not I'm able to be out in the community and out in the world.
Mm-hmm. So like work that it's like physically present.
Yeah.
Oh, how has the adjustment been? Catastrophic. It's been catastrophic for the theater scene. Like everybody has gone through a series of existential crises, and we've handled that trauma in all sorts of different ways. Some people are doing the dangerous thing of putting your head in the sand and blitzing forward with productions live and in person, despite the danger of that. And that's been a source of a lot of tension on the Philadelphia Theater Facebook group. But most people I know are keeping safe and responsible and figuring out how to innovate within that. The work that I've been doing since quarantine has been sparser, but still like pretty engaging. I find myself occupied a lot, even though I'm doing less stuff. And I think it's just a healthier pace for me. But for example, tomorrow in our time, so it'll be in the past when you all see this.
Yes.
Shoebox is live streaming a short Zoom play that I wrote and directed that will be starring Ange Bay, who was part of this interview series, and Jovito Ramirez, another member of Shoebox. And the driving force behind that piece was, how can we make self-conscious Zoom theater that embraces the limitations, the technological bugs, the distance, the imposed distance, and makes it into something honest.
Yeah, this is something I'm really looking forward to seeing. Kelly Orenshaw, who I work with at Venice Island and is one of the founding members of the Shoebox Theater Collective, which is the organization that Ryan is talking about. Kelly's told me about the play, but all I know about it is what you've just said, Ryan. So I can't wait to see it. And at the time that this interview is posted, we can also be posting the link to that so people can check out that play. For those who don't know, the Shoebox Theater Collective is a theater group that is in residence here at Venice Island. And it was created by Ryan and Kelly and a couple of other members of the Venice Island tech team. When Ryan mentioned that you do a lot of technical theater work, a lot of that happens here at Venice Island. And part of the genesis of this series was, as you've said, Ryan, the effect of COVID-19 on live theater has been catastrophic. That's a great word for it. And here at Venice Island, it was very important to us to figure out a way to stay connected with our performers and our collaborators and those who rent and utilize our space in a way that's safe, and therefore we had to go virtual. And the genesis of this series was just to have these conversations with our artists and collaborators. As everyone who's tuning in, certainly the two of you know, we had to pivot a little bit in June when we were initially going to launch the series, and that's where the racial tensions and the examples of systematic racism and violence that we alluded to in the introduction to this series really hit the forefronts of our national consciousness, and we decided that this series needed to be about having that conversation and being about amplifying the voices of those marginalized and those most affected by this movement. And the series really became about dealing with race and the arts and what those two of those terms mean in this current climate. So I want to, ask that question of both of you, either using, examples from interviews that you've conducted over the course of the series, or just your own experiences. Either of you feel free to go first. What do you think of when you think of race and the arts right now?
Yeah, so I can say that it's actually really interesting because I had started a project. I am in the midst of launching the Demystifying Diversity podcast, where I interviewed over 100 people about a wide range of topics pertaining to diversity. And so I started that project like well before what is happening, like, and what has been happening on a systemic level sort of came to public consciousness in a very just like the stark reality of these circumstances were highlighted for vastly more people than it had been before.
Yes.
And so I've been working in the space of diversity and really speaking to people about the effects of systemic racism and interviewing people who had been, you know, on the receiving end of police brutality and interviewing people who had been, you know, just really like discrimination has impacted their lives in such a way, or taken the lives of some people that they may have known or, you know, or been related to. And so for me, it was when the protests started to happen and when the deaths of people were sort of like visible to a mainstream audience, it was really just a reinforcement of the work that I had already been doing and the stories that I'd already been hearing. And I was kind of like, I knew how unaware people were prior to this, but it almost like, I was so surprised that that it's taken so long for people to become aware of these systemic injustices, but also I have to say, like, there was a part of me that was hopeful that, like, oh, okay, it's not just that people have been willfully not caring about these things or not invested in these things. It's like, oh, maybe people actually like really haven't been awake in the ways that I've taken for granted because of the work that I do. And so it's strange for me to be like in this moment where it feels like the rest of the world is kind of becoming conscious of these things that I've been working on and involved in for a very, very long time. And my hope is that people will stay awake. But you know, it's it's scary and it's sad. And in terms of the arts, like, I definitely think that there is great redemptive power in the arts, but I also think that the arts can be a great point into empathy. Because, you know, human emotions tend to be universal. And so if people who might not be able to relate to the specific stories that they might see in a 30-second soundbite on the news, like if they can see a play or a piece of art or read a book or something and connect with a character or with a lived experience in a way that feels more visceral or real, I think, like, hopefully that will be more of a catalyst for continued change. But yeah, this period feels very surreal to me, and like there's a lot of potential here, but there's also, I have a lot of fear that people won't like stay awake and keep doing the work.
When I think about race in the arts, unfortunately, I often am thinking about hypocrisy and inequality. I mentioned that I was raised in the burbs of Pittsburgh. First couple decades of my life were spent in all or mostly white environments. And reflecting back on that, having been educated more, having listened and gained more perspective, you can see all the ways that whiteness is blindness. And it's really scary. I was raised to think in terms of race, that if you're not a racist, you don't have to think about it that much. You know, people are people, that sort of thing. Which is, I think, a nefarious ideology and pretty far from the truth, because racism isn't just something you are a racist or not. It's something that moves through all white people and to some extent all people with internalized racism. And I think that's an important switch to flip, right? So when we criticize institutions, when we criticize people for their harmful actions, it's not just saying you're bad and you should go away forever. It's saying there's this thing that's moving through us that we need to recognize and work on. In terms of the anti-police protests and the discussions on race that came about because of that, yeah, we did see a lot of people waking up, to use your terms. In fact, some people very close to me shocked me by coming to realizations pretty late in their life that I didn't think were possible. On the other hand, we see a lot of institutions that are scrambling to cover their butts in a way that strikes me as extremely cynical in the arts community and broadly.
And I think it's really important, Ryan, the distinction that you make between, like, well, I guess just the clarification that you make about what racism means or how you view racism. And I remember one of the interviews that I conducted, I interviewed the director of Forward Promise and the director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative, Dr. Howard Stevenson, and he said that, if we're seeing racism as an issue of good or bad, moral or immoral, we're kind of missing the point, and we're really missing the historic and the systemic nature of things. And I think there are a lot of people that still can't wrap their heads around the fact that they might be really good people and have really good values and see all people as equal and want equitable policies, but still also not understand the ways that systemic racism have personally benefited or advantaged them or their loved ones or their families. And I think sometimes this idea of American individualism really butts up against, the systemic injustices that people are suffering as a result of race and the poverty that often goes along with being a person of color. And so, I think that we need to really think critically. People need to think critically about what exactly racism means, and that yes, it is possible to be a very good person and also still have benefited from a very racist system.
Yeah, and to be a good person who makes mistakes. In fact, the term good person, I think, is bound up in that individualism that you mentioned. Because if you are concerned mostly with whether you're good or bad, you're not thinking socially, you're not thinking culturally, interpersonally, or on a community level. And I strongly believe we have to move past this kind of toxic individualism that we're all really stuck in.
I love that you just mentioned, Brian, the word community, that's our responsibility as artists to think about the community level as opposed to just, am I a good person, to use, community language as opposed to me language, because one of the greatest things about theater is it brings people together. As we've already alluded to, that can't happen in a physical way right now. We have to figure out other ways that theater can bring people together. But one of my favorite things about theater has always been that theater can be a window into the world. That when you come together to see a production, you're seeing the same thing as other people at the same time in the same space, and therefore you're experiencing something together. And what better way to practice community and to practice empathy, another word that you used earlier, Ryan. So a theater piece that you co-directed last year, you with the Shoebox Theater Collective, Ryan. You co-directed the Medusa play with Ange Bay, who you interviewed earlier in the series. It's a piece that Ange wrote, and it deals a lot with these issues. And I remember I saw it last November, and and sitting in a very diverse audience, and exploring these issues was very powerful. So much seems to have changed since then in terms of our nation's wokeness, as we've talked about. I'm curious, what of the Medusa play do you think is most topical right now? Would this be a good time to revisit and produce the Medusa play if we could be producing traditional theater right now? Or in what ways would the piece have changed based on our new national conversation, if at all?
The Medusa play was and is ahead of its time, I think. It was poking at a lot of these hot-button issues, as you said, last November. I see the Medusa play in its various iterations as the anti-venom for the poison of institutionalized white supremacy. Its first iteration was at Ursinus College and was about toxic white supremacy in college institutions, based in large part on racist practices of Ursinus College. And from the administration to the student body. And when Shoebox came on to produce the Medusa play at Venice Island, we had a lot of, Ange and I had a lot of early discussions about how we wanted to pivot the show, and they ended up going from institutionalized white supremacy in a college environment to a theater environment, specifically a Philly theater environment. And it's amazing how easy it was to port a lot of the criticisms over while letting them develop in their specificity. I think that what the Medusa play has to say to people right now is that it's easy to call out white supremacy out there, from like racist police to egomaniacal Republicans to alt-right incels. Like, it's easy to point those fingers. It's not easy to really look at the white supremacy like in here and in here. And working on that production was painful for me in a lot of ways because it busted open a lot of my assumptions. It made me recognize white supremacy in institutions that I love, like Philadelphia Theater, like Venice Island, like Shoebox. And it made me recognize it in myself in ways that I wasn't prepared for. So, well, I guess I would say to like any white people hearing this that if you think you're good, you're probably not. And please, please listen. And above all, don't get defensive when criticized about race.
I think, Ryan, something that you touched on that feels really important is, even though you're labeling things white supremacy, I think people sometimes hear that and they get the sense of like, okay, you're just talking about race. Like, we're just talking about the black-white binary. But I think something that I've learned from my own work in the diversity space is the intersectionality of oppression, right? So that like when I hear you say white supremacy, I feel like there's so much that falls under that umbrella that has to do with race, gender, culture, religion, like so many different communities that have been xenophobia, so many different communities that have been impacted and continue to be impacted by the discrimination and othering. And I think that, I think that that's an important thing to think about, that like when we're talking about liberation and diversity and equity and inclusion work, like race is often the easiest place to see those oppressions, but it has an effect that goes far beyond the black-white binary.
You're right. This is why we say Black Lives Matter, right? Because it is intersectional, because it's a particular experience that is also universal. And we, we don't like talk about white supremacy lightly either. We say it with anger, but also with love, because we care about these things. And like, since we're talking about Shoebox, I think it's a great example. All of our founding members of Shoebox were white. And in our early productions, our production teams were white, and the vast majority of our casts were white. And we were creating a positive, great environment for these collaborators and doing a lot of good work. But that doesn't mean that we weren't complicit in white supremacy and that we didn't have a lot of work to do to actually challenge the community and ourselves to be inclusive. And our work is not finished, but after like years of kind of awakening to this and making conscious efforts to change, Shoebox is now like a really like a great eclectic collective of like all sorts of different people. We're now only half white at Shoebox, and we're like trying to produce more hard-hitting and honest work, right? So recognizing that white supremacy is the first step to somewhere important.
I have a question that I'd love both of your thoughts on, that I wasn't intending to ask, but it has been on my mind, and hearing you talk about Shoebox, and I guess the journey from having all white founding members, which is not uncommon, as you've alluded to, in the Philadelphia theater community, to an organization that right now you're considered half white, which is great. But I guess you have to start somewhere, and it has to start with one. But at what point do you fear, in a situation like a production, a theater scene with, let's say, an all-white creative and design team, at what point does bringing on a single artist of color or a single designer of color become tokenism? For instance, let's say there's a production that, like, all right, our entire team is set except for the sound designer, and we're all white. We need to go out and find a sound designer of color. Well, does that make the sound designer of color uncomfortable, being the only person of color in that room? And at what point do you try to embrace that or try to avoid that? What are am I making my question clear?
Yeah, that's...
I'd love Ryan to go first, yeah.
Sure. It's a really good and difficult question. This is why the leadership is important, right? So you're right. If you are bringing on like one person as a token effort, arguably better than having a completely white group, but that person is going to probably not feel super at home, feel like they're like stepping on eggshells. A lot of their ideas are going to get shut down, and they're not going to be, likely not going to be an equal collaborator in that way. This has been something that's come up in several of my interviews, a lot with Ange. We talked about tokenization and how that how it feels to be in that position, and why you would choose to do that or not. And in my interview with Shav'on Smith, the founder of Grounded Theater Company, we talked about why she preferred to start her own company rather than try to like bang her head against the wall, busting into these mostly white institutions. So the conversation has shifted in the last couple of years from we need diverse casts to like show the world that we're woke, to we actually need white people to make sacrifices, step down or elevate Black people and other people of color to positions of actual power, rather than just so some of those more forward-facing positions, like you mentioned, Daralyse.
It's about how the hiring process is done and who is in charge, who's doing the hiring process, who's in charge.
I guess I see another potential element. So Ryan made the point earlier about really interrogating the systemic nature of things and looking at areas of deficiency. And I think once people have done that work and looked at systems or organizations or institutions and looked at what's missing and recognizing that people of color like have a lot to offer in terms of filling in those voids, I think it becomes less about tokenism and more about actually meeting a need and a vacancy. And I think that when people can and organizations can recognize, like, wow, we have this whole area that we are not privy to and we are never going to be because of the nature of our experiences, our histories, and we actually need people of color in order to make us a better organization. I think then you're far less likely to have tokenism happen and just more of a recognition of like, oh yeah, if we have cultural richness and diversity and racial diversity and gender diversity, like things get better and our work gets better and the quality of what's produced gets better and we are more honest and we are representing larger audiences. Like, I kind of think that tokenism can't happen. I think tokenism happens from a belief that you're offering something to someone, as opposed to the very real fact that people have different lived experiences can offer a lot to an organization. And so, yeah, like I think it really is about a paradigm shift. And once that happens, I think you're a lot less likely to have that sort of token, like, oh, we need to fill this spot with one person of color just because. It's like, no, actually, we have a deficit. And like, what are we going to do about this deficit?
Yeah, speaking personally, when Shoebox started to transition into trying to abate that whiteness, it did feel like tokenization at first, because we were like, oh, who do we know, who we can ask, like who, you know. The more invested you get in it, though, the more your community grows, and you're just like, oh no, I just want to work with all these phenomenal artists. I think we've been seeing examples of both ends of what you're describing, Daralyse, in the Philadelphia theater community recently. We saw Playpen take the wrong approach and be extraordinarily defensive about the ways that they have tokenized in the past. And both of their artistic directors have either been fired or stepped down, and the organization's in a bit of a shambles now. But we're also seeing a lot of organizations that are trying to make anti-racist action plans, consulting Black folks, people of color. And recently, we've been getting some like exciting announcements, like Theater Philadelphia named Lanish Miller White as the new executive director of and Theater Philadelphia is a pretty powerful organization, so that's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm less familiar with the theater world and more familiar with the improv world, but there are two like very, very prestigious comedy improv organizations in the city of Philadelphia, one being FIT and the other being Comedy Sports. And like you're really seeing how the leadership at Comedy Sports, like their desire to really like do better and be better and grow and and their willingness to acknowledge that like not everything has been perfect, but we really want to learn and we want to expand and we want to make this a more inclusive and equitable environment and invite fuller participation from our more diverse cast members. Like Comedy Sports seems to be really thriving and moving forward and growing as an organization and doing the work and FIT, it's the total reverse of that. And frankly, I was a member of the We the People, improv team that produced a festival in Philly every year, and we realized that we could no longer align ourselves with FIT leadership and with that organization. And I think, for precisely the reasons that you're speaking to, Ryan, like there is a real difference between how leadership looks at areas for potential growth and what they're willing to do. And I'm a very proud member of Comedy Sports that precisely, like at least in part, I mean, for a whole host of reasons, but at least in part because of just their willingness to grow into more diversity and to really like ask their cast members and try to figure out like what can we do better and and what are our blind spots.
And if I may,
Dara, I didn't realize you were part of that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Ryan.
I didn't realize you were part of that We the People festival. I'm sorry. I heard about this. And talking about defensiveness, I understand that the white person in charge received criticism and then blocked everybody on Facebook. So that's somebody who's not willing to listen, right? Yeah. So.
And I was only going to add regarding Comedy Sports, both locally and nationally, there's a movement. Unlike Philly Improv Theater, which is FIT, Comedy Sports is a national organization with comedy sports leagues and teams and companies in I think 32 cities and internationally. There's one in Manchester as well. And there's been a local. There's been a recent effort to make sure that every team has a director of diversity inclusion, which is new and which has been really valuable.
And I think to the whole point of like just diversity in general, diversity of ideas, and you had talked about community and collaboration, like I think what we're seeing is when leadership is sort of like top down, one person in charge making all the decisions, it's way easier to have those blind spots and to not necessarily be willing to like take the ideas of others and to learn and to grow. But I think organizations that have sort of more disparate leadership, it can be frustrating in the moment because everybody wants things to happen yesterday and like you want your agenda to be pushed forward. But I think there's a whole lot of beauty in collaboration. And I know for me, like I have a business partner on the project that I'm working on now, and sometimes we have different ideas, but there's a great richness in that back and forth process. And I feel like we're way more attuned to potential areas of deficit as a result of that creative collaboration than either of us would be if we were working it.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to hear a little bit more about that project that you're working on, Dara, and then what you're working on as well, Ryan. But tell us just a little bit more about the Demystifying Diversity podcast, which I think is the project that you're referring to. Is that something that you're still filming? Is it ongoing?
If people can subscribe now to the Demystifying Diversity podcast. The season officially launches in September, but the trailer is out, and so you can subscribe now to get that, delivered in your podcast inbox, and it's everywhere that podcasts are available. And we also have the Demystifying Diversity podcast website, which is just demystifyingdiversitypodcast.com. And you can find out all sorts of information about how the project got started and who we are. And we're two biracial female journalists who just set out to really better understand issues of diversity and learn so much. And really upgraded the quality of our questions along the way. So I don't know that we're going to give you any answers, but we ask a whole lot of amazing questions. And we have just the voices of a lot of really notable people, from like a U.S. senator to an incarcerated inmate, and everyone and everywhere in between. And it's a really beautiful project.
So of all of the hundreds of interviews that you've been conducting over the last year, none of that is live yet. That launches in September?
Yeah, it launches in September, but subscribe now. Yeah.
Okay, great. And we're going to post that information in the comments of this interview and on our Facebook page at Venice Island. Ryan, you've mentioned the Zoom play that will have launched by the time people are listening to this. What else is keeping you busy in your quarantine, or what else are you working on now?
Sure, I'll do some rapid fire plugs. Yeah, check out Paul on Shoebox, Shoebox Theater Collective, our website, our Facebook. Check out Revolution Shakespeare's project that's coming out soon, the Sonnets Revisited. So this company has paid a ton of really amazing artists, including myself, to rewrite and act in Shakespeare, all of Shakespeare's sonnets.
Yes.
And like the money's important, ethically sourced art. I write film criticism on post-credit coda on Blogspot, and you can commission me to write film criticism at patreon.com/postcreditcoda. And finally, Ange Bay, part of Shoebox, but also artistic director at Wings of Paper Theater Company. Shav'on Smith, artistic director at Grounded Theater Company. Check those companies out. They're great.
That is awesome, Ryan. I did not know about that Revolution Shakes project, although I like that company quite a bit. So thank you for telling us about that. Again, we're going to post all of this information. Thank you, Ryan and Daralyse, for taking this journey with us at Venice Island over the course of the summer. Thank you for everyone who has tuned in, and thank you to the community of Maniac. That is our community here at Venice Island, and I'm very grateful to the Maniac restaurants who have been our featured restaurants in this series: Winnie's Maniac, Lucky's Last Chance, the Maniac Tavern, the Maniac Brewing Company, and La Roca. These are all great local institutions that we hope folks will check out. If you are physically in Maniac, please do so safely. And again, thank you all for joining us, particularly Ryan, Daralyse, and all of our guests. You can watch past interviews on our YouTube channel, the link to which we will add to the comments of this interview. Thank you again, everyone. Be safe and enjoy the rest of your summer.
When something's in your heart's on your sleeve, then everyone can tell all the hopes and dreams they left behind the shell. And the wives and daughters came into our life while they lift their veil. Somehow they can see and still believe in a dream beside a light that fell.